Makes me want to be ready, that's for sure. What an incredible way to lead us in worship. Thank you, Sanctuary Choir. Just had an opportunity to preach to college students who still, of their own volition, not pressured by their parents, make worship at a church, a local church, part of their educational pilgrimage, and I appreciate them for that. We've been utilizing our time together on Sunday mornings, as you know, to look at the one another passages in the Bible. Most of these are in the New Testament. Although there are two words, one another, in English, in the Greek, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, it's just one word, allalon. And in previous sermons together, we've looked at love one another, serve one another, encourage one another, bear ye one another's burdens, pray for one another. And for just a few moments today, I want us to examine live in harmony with one another. The basis for that is the high priestly prayer of Jesus, which has already been shared with you this morning. I would encourage you to read the 17th chapter of John's Gospel. It is really Jesus' high priestly prayer. In the prayer, he prays for three things. First of all, he prays for himself. He prays for the strength that he's going to need to face what is right before him, which is the cross of Calvary. He prays for himself. Someone has asked me, even this past week, is it okay to pray for yourself? Yes. It is more than okay to share anything in your heart with God. Jesus prayed for himself. In the second place, Jesus prayed for his disciples. There were 11 of them still gathered. Judas had already made his exit in that upper room. He wanted to prepare them for the time that was coming when they would be asked to be the body of Christ, the hands, feet, the voice of Christ, without Christ's physical presence. And he said, in order for you to do that, and this is reflected in the prayer, you've got to be one. Doesn't mean that you're going to think the same on every issue, but you've got to be united. You've got to be in this Christianity thing together. You've got to love one another and live in harmony. The third section of the prayer is a prayer which was already shared with you this morning. And in that, Jesus is praying for us. He's praying for all future believers, everyone that's heard the message proclaimed by the disciples down through the ages. He's praying for us, for all people. And it's interesting that when he prays for us, he doesn't pray for our success. He doesn't even at this particular time pray for our health. You know what he prays for? He prays that we would be united. He prays that we would live in harmony with one another. Because by doing that, he says, that is what will motivate the world to be drawn to the church, to be drawn through Christ. Ladies and gentlemen, how can we expect to share the good news of Jesus Christ with those outside the church if we can't get along with people in the church? And I'm not talking about in the local church. I'm talking about all Christian churches. So many Christian churches, so many different denominational backgrounds, but could we acknowledge that we focus upon Jesus Christ as Lord and learn to cooperate together just a bit more perhaps than we've done in the past? The sign on the church in rural Tennessee said, Left Foot Baptist Church. Really did. Some people visited the church. They wanted to explore, why in the world are you called Left Foot Baptist Church? Turned out that this was a foot washing church tradition. And once upon a time, there had been just one church, and they engaged in foot washing, which is certainly fine. But I've already told you about my feet, and that's why I'm not a foot washing. But anyway, it's fine. But one day, I know you can't imagine this, in a business meeting, a dispute arose among the foot washing Baptists as to which foot should be washed first. We've always washed the right foot first, of course, some said. And they had the majority. But some said, no, we think we ought to wash the left foot first. And they got so mad and angry, they left the church, formed a new church, the Left Foot Baptist Church. That's pretty funny. But it's also pretty sad. Philip Melanchthon, who was a cohort of Martin Luther, a wonderful theologian in his own right, put it this way: in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, left foot or right foot, liberty. In all things, charity, which is love. Wouldn't that be good for Christians, whatever denomination, non-denomination, church all over the world, to remember in essentials that Jesus Christ is Lord? Unity. Be united on that. Keep the main thing the main thing. But in non-essentials, what time do you have worship service? I mean, the Bible says 11 o'clock. You know that, right? 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Does anybody know why we have worship service at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning? Anybody out there ever milk a cow? Got any cow milkers out there? Do you know why we have church at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning? It's not just so we can hurry up and get there and beat the Methodists at lunch. No. You know why it is? Because we were pretty much a rural society, and if you had the worship service at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, that allowed the farmers to get up early enough to milk the cows, to do all the chores, to get cleaned up and get to church by 11 o'clock. And then for those churches that had Sunday night worship, they'd have it at 7 o'clock because that gave the farmers time to, do the whole thing all over again. Back in Midway, we had church at 10:45. That was in Hezekiah 4:11 in the Bible, someplace. That's not a book of the Bible. But you know why we had it at 10:45 and it really wasn't so we'd get out at 11:45 and beat everybody at the restaurant? It's because we had numerous students from Midway College, which at that point was an all-girls school. They were required to go to church, so we had a lot of those ladies, but they also, if they wanted to eat lunch, had to be back on campus by 12. And even though we had a lot of farmers and cow milkers before that and used to have the service at 11, we decided we better change the time to 10:45. Forgive us for not taking a literal interpretation of Hezekiah 4:11, and that's what happened. In essentials, Christ is Lord, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. Give people some slack. But in all things, charity, which is love. I'm still bemused that we don't get it. That Christ really means for us to really work hard at getting along, not just with ourselves, not just with Baptists, but with all of his followers. But sometimes we can't even get along with ourselves. There's a story which circulates in preacher circles, and it's about a man who was stranded on a deserted island. He was stranded there for about 7 years. No ships came, no helicopters, no planes, and he was just trying to survive. He thought, well, this is it. No other human beings, that's it. 7 years. One day, to his amazement and overwhelming joy and delight, he saw a cruise ship far off in the distance. And he immediately gathered wood and brush and built a fire, and there was all kinds of smoke. And lo and behold, the cruise ship got closer and closer and sent a little boat, a little dinghy out to see this guy. What's going on? Haven't been in civilization for 7 years. We're here to rescue you. And he was just overjoyed. The crew on that little dinghy said, come on, get in this dinghy. We're going to take you back to civilization. But first we noticed that this island isn't very big. I guess you've been here a long time and you had to survive. He said, well, what are those 3 buildings you've got there? He said, oh, that building up there. He said, that's my house. Spent a lot of time. That's my house. You see that second building up there? That's my church. That's where I go to church. And he started to get on the boat and said, wait a minute, what's the third building? He said, That's where I used to go to church. In essentials, unity. Non-essentials, liberty. In all things, Christians. Charity, which is love. Well, why should we carry out this live in harmony with one another command? And how are we going to do it? So just two questions. Why and how? Why? First reason, Jesus asked us to. It's right there in the high priestly prayer. The way that people are going to be drawn to the church and subsequently drawn to me, Jesus said, is if you all love each other. Do you remember what he's just said in a few chapters previously in John's Gospel? By this will all men know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And his prayer is, Lord, help them to have this love. Help them to focus on the main thing. Help them to live and serve in harmony. Help them to be one. The preacher was preaching on that passage from John 17, Lord, help them to be one. But he also happened to have the children's sermon that day, and there were children that were gathered around. And one little 3-year-old girl, she was especially interested in listening to this preacher give the children's sermon, and he said, boys and girls, Jesus tells us that he wants us all to get along, that he wants us all to be united, that we all are to be one. And she said, I want to be 4. And sometimes we want to be 4 or 5 or 9 or 11 or whatever our particular thoughts, feelings, interpretations might be. Father, Jesus prayed, help them to live in harmony and be one. That doesn't mean everybody's supposed to go to one big church. That doesn't mean that everybody's supposed to be part of the same denomination. But according to William Barclay's interpretation of this passage, it means we are to be one in our relationship with Christ. There are a lot of people in a lot of different churches, denominational churches, Baptist churches, Catholic churches, Eastern Orthodox churches, all over the world who can affirm that basic truth that Jesus Christ is Lord. That's the main thing. And we need to know that we have a relationship with them. So, why carry out this live in harmony commandment? Jesus asks us to. The second reason is pretty much related. If we'll carry this out, it will remind us that all people are important. That John 3:16 is not for God so loved part of the world or the American world or our world, but it's God so loved the world. The 2016 Summer Olympics were held in Rio, and I enjoy watching all the Olympic Games. But I was especially intrigued one day when I saw a particular commercial. It happened to be a commercial by Apple. But the whole commercial dealt with unity and harmony and getting along. The commercial featured the poetry of Maya Angelou entitled The Human Family. It goes as follows. I note the obvious differences in the human family. Some of us are serious. Some thrive on comedy. Some declare their lives are lived as true profundity, and others claim they really live the real reality. The variety of our skin tones can confuse, bemuse, delight, brown and pink and beige and purple, tan and blue and white. I've sailed upon the 7 seas and stopped in every land. I've seen the wonders of the world, not yet one common man. I know 10,000 women called Jane and Mary Jane, but I've not seen any two who really were the same. Mirror twins are different, although their features jibe, and lovers think quite different thoughts while lying side by side. We love and lose in China, we weep on England's moors, and laugh and moan in Guinea, and thrive on Spanish shores. We seek success in Finland, are born and die in Maine. In minor ways we differ, but in major ways we're the same. I note the obvious differences between each sort and type, but we are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. Father, help them to be one. Help them to live in harmony. Help them to keep the main thing the main thing. Help us to live and serve in love. Well, that's something of the why. Let me give you a little bit of the how. How can we put this live in harmony commandment into practice? The first thing we can do is practice a method that I'm going to tell you about in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you about what happened in a Jewish synagogue over a period of several Friday nights. There was a new rabbi in town. He was young, new, kind of his first assignment. He had gone on Friday night to several of the services, and much to his dismay, there was a part of the service where half of the congregation would stand and the other half of the congregation would sit. And he thought that was quite unusual. They behaved okay. He was a new rabbi. They wanted to make a good impression. Next Friday, they had the same service, and he noticed they got to this particular part, and half the congregation would stand, and they would stare at the people who were sitting. And by the next week, the people who were standing started shouting in the service at the people who were sitting, and they started screaming at the people who were standing. And the young rabbi said, "Lord, what have I gotten into?" And so, maybe a little bit wise beyond his years, he sought out the advice of the old rabbi, who was 99 years old and living in a nursing home. Because one side said, "This is the tradition we stand," and one side said, "This is the tradition we sit." So wisely, he took one representative from the "we're going to stand" side and one representative from the "we're going to sit during this part" side, and they went to see the rabbi. And the representative of the "we ought to stand at this part" side said, "Rabbi, we all know it's a tradition for us to stand during this part of the service." And the rabbi said, "That's not the tradition." And the one from the sitting side was feeling pretty good. He said, "Rabbi, now we know that the tradition is that we all ought to be seated during this part of the service." He said, that's not the tradition. And the young rabbi said, "Oh my gosh, it's just utter chaos there. What are we going to do?" He said, "The people who are standing shout at those who are sitting, and those who are sitting are screaming at those who are shouting." And the old rabbi said, "That's the tradition." So how do we get along? How do we live in harmony? Practice a method that Richard Myers calls the CLASP method. CLASP. The C means calm down. Count to 10 or 100. Or 1,000 if you need to. But when there is conflict, when there's disagreement, calm down. The L means lower your voice. I really doubt that there have ever been many arguments or disagreements settled over screaming. Do you really think that helps? Lower your voice. Calm down, lower your voice, and the A, acknowledge the other person's position. They might be right. You might be wrong. Both of you might need to modify some things. If it's essential that Jesus Christ is Lord, okay, but in non-essentials, acknowledge their position. They see it a different way. The S is state your position. You don't have to give up what you believe, but you might need to understand that somebody else just as good as you, just as loved by God as you, might see it a little bit differently than you. Calm down, lower your voice, acknowledge the other person's position, state your opinion, and the P is propose a solution that can bring peace and unity to both sides. Is it easy to practice clasp? No. Is it worth it? Yes. Christ calls us all to live in harmony and get along. Second practical thing you can do is claim Christ as the common ground. There was a theologian, minister, many years ago now, Dr. Newman Hall. He wrote a book, Come to Jesus. Poured his life and soul and heart in that book. The book was published, lots of acclaim, but this one other minister read the book and he gave the most negative review of that book that you can imagine. This guy seems uneducated. This is just trash. This is trivial, superficial stuff. And it made Dr. Newman Hall so angry. He whipped off the most vociferous sounding letter that you have ever seen. I'll get even with this guy, he said. But he did have the forethought before he sent the letter to let his friend, who happened to be Dr. Charles Spurgeon, read it. And Spurgeon read the letter, and he said, well, there's just one other thing you need to do. He said, what's that? You need to add under your name, Dr. Newman Hall, author of Come to Jesus. What if in our disagreements, in our conflicts, in our seemingly inability sometimes to get along, what if we practiced and claimed Christ as common ground, come to Jesus? What would Jesus do? What would Jesus say? What would Jesus have us do in this situation? Come to Jesus. Practice clasp. Come to Jesus. Adapt an attitude of grace. Ken Blanchard, leadership author who wrote 1 Minute Manager, great book, Ken Blanchard. But Ken Blanchard talked to his guru, his mentor, Peter Drucker, who's one of the most intelligent people around, one day, and he said, Peter, why in the world are you a Christian? You're so intelligent and know all this stuff. Why in the world, Peter Drucker, are you a Christian? And Peter said, because it's the best deal going. He said, what do you mean it's the best deal going? And Drucker said, it's all about grace. We all need a little wiggle room. We all need a little, if not a lot, of forgiveness. We all need some unmerited divine favor. We could all use a little grace. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity, which is love. We really are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We're really more alike, my friends, than we are unalike.